Okie doke. Second of the final three videos. I just checked the first one. I realized you can't in fact see my mouse pointer, which is what I probably thought you couldn't. So I gotta remember not to use that. But I don't think it should matter. So there's this idea that as we get richer, our motivation for supplying labor shifts from the absolute sort of value, intrinsic value of consumption to this consumption race. Okay. And what are the implications of this for the environment? That's what this 10-15 minute video is about. Okay, so in general, I can't remember if we talked about this, but there are three channels through which consumption externalities might affect environmental damages, and these are the three channels that are pretty standard, and I think I probably mentioned them before. There's a scale effect, technique effect, and a composition effect. Scale effect is if we all work too hard because of this keeping up with the Joneses consumption race, well, that means too much production. More production means more environmental damage. The technique effect is, but wait, if we all work really hard, then we're earning more income. That is going to raise our willingness to pay for environmental quality. And if a regulator takes note of that, that might even lead, well, that will lead to a countervailing effect, an effect going the other way for higher environmental quality. So it's an open question then, which is the stronger, the scale effect or the technique effect? The third one is the composition effect, that maybe we get status from consuming specifically environmentally damaging goods, or maybe it's just energy intensive goods, which also tend to be environmentally damaging, like flights and big cars and stuff. So I claimed that consumption externalities lead to oversupply of labour and hence a scale effect driving up pollution flows. But in this first part of the video, we're going to look at the technique effect, and then in the second part, we're going to look at the possible composition effect. Not much literature out there on this. Okay, this is research I'm doing right now. It's not part of the course, yeah. So let's just start with a super simple model without any composition effects. So we're just looking at scale effects and technique effects. Okay, so that was our baseline model. Don't worry too much about the equations, but if you like the math and so on, of course you can study the equations, but I'm not going to take you through them in the video, I don't think, much at all anyway. Add resource use and associated pollution flows. So, sure. Now we're splitting the labor between the final good production and the resource sector. 1 minus delta H goes to final good production. Delta H goes to the resource sector. Out of the resource sector, we get this flow of the resource intensive input. We can think of it as energy, Ki. And we also have a flow of pollution out of that sector, which is just phi times K. Okay, so this is a very simple model now. The energy input, if we think of it as energy, is directly proportional to the polluting emissions. It's as if we've only got coal, yeah, or whatever. There's no flexibility there. But there is flexibility in how much energy we can use, right? And then environmental quality is 1 minus psi times the pollution flow, right? So that's phi and psi, yeah. And of course, I'm sure you all know delta. Okay. And this C is AH, blah, blah, blah. What's going on here? This is actually a CES production function between the labor input, which is this, and the energy input, which is this. AH delta, that's the energy input, and AH1 minus delta, that is the labor input. into this sector. Okay, go K is equal to AH delta. And this is a CES function, and the elasticity of substitution is eta. That is a measure of how willing firms are to substitute between, or how easily they can substitute between the labor input and the energy input. And eta varies between 0 and infinity. And when eta is 1, that is Cobb-Douglas. When eta is 0, that is Leontief. When eta is infinity, that's perfect substitutes. Okay, so it's slightly differently defined than the way we've done it with that epsilon, 1 over epsilon. So now it's 0, 1, infinity instead of minus infinity, 0, 1. Yeah. Okay, so that's the firm's elasticity. And then the household elasticity is epsilon. And again, notice that that is also defined in this new way, so that 0 is no substitutability, 1 is Cobb-Douglas, infinite is perfect substitutability. Okay, cool. And we stick with a single good. There's only one good produced in this economy, so there's no composition effects. Okay. Just taking you through that. We can set up the social planners Lagrangian. We can set up a regulated market Lagrangian with a consumption tax sigma. Again, don't worry too much about the equations. If you're interested, you can study them. I'm not going to take you through them. And we can work out actually an optimal tax. Sigma star is the optimal tax on the consumption good, and Tor star is the optimal tax on emissions, what we call the Pigovian tax, which is increasing in C and increasing in P. If you think of, so the bigger consumption is and the bigger the pollution flow is, the bigger the tax will be. And remember, epsilon here is, it's somewhere in this interval, right? It's less than 1. There's not much. Consumers aren't that keen to substitute between the different arguments of the utility function, right? That would be below 0 in the way we usually formulated things earlier in the course. Okay, so epsilon is positive but less than 1. So that's why clearly you can see that Tor star increases in C and it increases in P. Okay. But how do these things interact? So what have we got here? Here we've got the standard EKC picture, right? With environmental quality and consumption interacting, and the PPFs. As the PPFs move out, we're going to follow the red path in laissez-faire and one of these green paths under optimal regulation. So what happens when labor is oversupplied because of this consumption externality? Well, if epsilon is less than eta, epsilon was household flexibility, eta was firm flexibility. If households are less flexible than firms, then when they oversupply labor, they've got too much income, rich people demand environmental quality, inflexible rich people demand environmental quality from their governments. Flexible firms are happy when the Pigovian tax is raised, are happy to substitute between energy and labor. They will cut their energy use and environmental quality improves. Okay, so the technique effect in this model actually outweighs the scale effect. Okay, so if the only effect of this status composition is to cause us to oversupply labor and overconsume, then that overconsumption will lead us as rich people to put more pressure onto our government to say, look, we want a cleaner environment. We've got all this money and all this nice stuff, but we want also clean air to breathe, thanks. Environmental regulations will get tougher if the government responds to that optimally. And in fact, the environmental quality will be higher than it would have been if the government had dealt with the status externality. Okay. And we can see that in this figure. Okay. So this is laissez-faire. If the government does nothing, we have an environmental disaster before too long, right? And of course, the kind of technologies we have in the world today, if we didn't have environmental regulations, we would have had a wipeout long ago, you know. So we would be down here we would have like hit this x-axis a long time ago. So that's laissez-faire. What about if we just correct the scale effect, if we just correct the consumption externality, the oversupply of labor, then we take a bit more leisure and we scale down production a bit, and oh great, we delay the environmental disaster by a few years. Okay, so sure, it improves things, but not much. Okay, what's happening here? Here we've only corrected the environmental externality. So we've still got oversupply of labor, too little leisure. But now, as we start to get richer, people demand much tougher environmental regulation. Their willingness to pay for environmental quality goes up, and the flexible firms respond to that and cut their pollution. Okay, so that is with optimal Piagettian tax. And this is all the numerical simulations, by the way, based on, you know, an actual model with actual values. So that's the technique effect of the tax. And finally, this is first best when you correct both the oversupply of labor and the environmental externality, and you end up with slightly worse environmental quality. Okay, higher utility, but because people are more chilled, they're working less, they have lower incomes, their pressure for environmental regulation is not as high in this model. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. Right, but what about composition effects? And here it gets super complicated, so we'll be just skimming over things here. And we've already talked about how this is super complicated. There's my paper arguing that we shift to energy intensive goods as GDP rises. There's a paper by a guy called Heffetz who says we shift to visible goods, like status giving goods, maybe as income rises. There's the Sager paper that we talked a lot about. There's some other papers, including some papers like in the Journal of JIBO, what's it called? The Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, which argues that energy intense goods give status because of evolutionary selection pressure. So there's various ideas that maybe energy intense stuff gives status. Okay, but it's complicated. I'm not going to take you through this. It's too complicated. It's going to take too much time. Can we capture this stuff in a model? Well, for now, I'm just going to show you something. So we had this baseline model. I'm just going to take you through this super quick. Yeah, it's kind of optional extra. But then we're going to simplify it and go over to Cobb-Douglas in here. Okay, so instead of this CES with those epsilon etas in, we just go straight to a Cobb-Douglas, right? So it's just simplifying a bit. Here, it's a Cobb-Douglas production function with labor and energy. Okay, and then what else are we going to do? We're going to say that status is given not by Ci over C, but given literally by the energy consumption contained in your goods. Okay, so you get direct utility from the consumption goods themselves, but your status comes from showing off how energy intense your consumption is. Okay. So this is quite an extreme assumption. This is very pessimistic about consumers' preferences. But if they have these preferences that they just love to show off energy consumption, what happens then? And it turns out it's very different. Okay. So that was the picture we had before. Okay. So that's still the picture we had before, but I'm dropping the labor supply because it's not so interesting, and I made the lines thin. So that's the old lines for environmental quality laissez-faire, environmental quality when we correct the labor supply, environmental quality when we correct the environmental externality, and environmental quality in first best. Okay. What happens when we change the model and say that status is given not by C but by energy consumption K, or relative energy consumption? That, in laissez-faire, pushes the red curve, the laissez-faire curve is pushed this way. We choose more energy intense forms of consumption, and there is sort of global disaster earlier. The two if we correct the consumption externality, then it doesn't matter what that externality is because we corrected it. So the dark blue and green lines, in both of which the consumption externality, the status composition thing, is sorted out, well, they're the same as in the previous model, okay, because we sorted it out. But if we don't sort out the consumption externality, but do sort out the environmental externality, in the old model, things were fine, but in the new model, they're not, okay. So even when we tax emissions from energy use optimally according to the Pigovian tax, so households individually demand, oh, you know, it's so dirty, we want you to sort out better environment. The government taxes that at the right level for that. But what the government doesn't see is that the household is also demanding all this energy intensive stuff because of an externality. If the government doesn't see that that is also an externality, that race to consume energy intensive stuff, which causes environmental damage, it's not completely unchecked, that's laissez-faire, but it still causes huge problems. So in equilibrium, we end up with much lower environmental quality, even as we get incredibly rich, incredibly productive. Okay, so just the point is here that potentially these consumption externalities, if they are leading to a composition effect, pushing us towards environmental damaging patterns of consumption, that could require specific policies to deal with over and above Pigovian taxes. Okay. So, summing things up, consumption externalities can open an increasingly large wedge between optimal labour supply, which should approach zero, and laissez-faire labour supply, which approaches some constant level. But oversupply of labour may actually be good for the environment because the scale effect might be outweighed by a technique effect driven by Pigovian taxes. But if consumption externalities drive a composition effect towards definitely dirty goods, then they are very bad for the environment. Assume our choices are driven by a status game. If it's zero sum, we should coordinate on goods that actually raise utility, like leisure. In any case, we should coordinate on choices that do not damage public goods, leisure. So this is more of a stepping back from the model. What can we conclude? Again, stepping back from the model. Why do we work so hard? Okay, in the model it was consumption, competition for status through consumption. But maybe we just like working. It's our urge, as Keynes said, to strive and not to enjoy. But if that's the case, that puts an even more intense focus on environmental damages from production. Assume we only engage in production to keep ourselves amused, then surely the least we can do is ensure that the process doesn't damage public goods. Okay, and that is the end of a somewhat overlong second video.